All right, and we're live. Welcome, folks, tuning in to this live Twitch stream. And for anyone who's watching the replay, welcome to the replay in whatever form you're consuming that in.
Yeah.
My name is Dormain Drewitz. This is a new Twitch show that we have here on the PagerDuty Twitch channels called Unplanned, which is a little bit of a double entendre in honor of both the unplanned work that we see and work to help with at PagerDuty with the operations cloud, and also because there's not a significant amount of planning that's going into these episodes. Obviously, trying to schedule interesting guests and have starting point, talking points, but it's unscripted, very much rules of improv. And I'm excited to have our inaugural guest with me, Damon Edwards. Damon, you want to say hello?
Yeah, first rule of improv. So I just have to say yes, and I'm happy to have you here. Dormain is just kidding. So yeah, Damon Edwards. I now work at PagerDuty. A lot of people knew me from my Rundeck days. I was one of the co-founders of Rundeck, which is a runbook automation tool that we happily sold to PagerDuty about 2.5 years ago, and been working on product stuff here ever since. As PagerDuty has been, caught our attention, really is expanding from the, on-call notification company, right? Send an alert in, we'll send it out to all the right people and escalate accordingly, to really a full, platform for operations work, right? For all that time-sensitive work. Time is money. When you have to collaborate on complex systems, we're assembling all the tools you need to do that as cheaply and efficiently as possible, disrupting as few as people as possible. Yeah, I work on all that stuff, and that's how I got to know you, Dormain.
Yeah. So full disclosure, Damon and I have, I don't know, we've caught up every couple of weeks now for probably the better part of the last year. So it just sort of felt natural to bring some of these conversations. Damon always has insightful and interesting pearls of wisdom. And I was like, man, we need to be just getting this out into the universe. But before I throw a few questions Damon's way, I want to quickly, let me just pull up here, share with folks a couple of the upcoming episodes. I realize there is some irony in saying that we have planned episodes of the Unplanned show, but there is a certain amount of sanity that I need to keep for myself. So yes, we have some upcoming planned episodes. Next week, I'll have Hadija Creary on, and she is going to be breaking down customer success versus customer service. So this was just, she mentioned kind of some insights on this recently, and I was like, hold the phone. We need to talk this through live with people. We'll be taking a pause on June 19th to recognize Juneteenth as a holiday. We honor that holiday at PagerDuty. So same thing here on our Monday-based Twitch show. Then we'll be back on June 26th. I've got a sort of panel with Lear Engel, Ben Wiegelman, and Everaldo Aguiar, who I've been working on an article around their learnings from building with generative AI. I know that's a hot topic. It may or may not come up today. Then again, we'll be taking a pause for the July 4th break, and then we'll be back on July 10th with Sriram Subramanian from Microsoft, who gave a great talk at GlueCon a couple weeks ago on responsible generative AI. So I wanted to give him a chance to kind of explore that in a different setting, and I just had some questions for him. And then following that, July 17th, we'll have James Urquhart from VMware on about flow architecture. He published a book, an O'Reilly book on flow architecture pretty recently. And as he was talking through that at GlueCon, it just, a bunch of ideas popped in my head. So I thought, what better place to ask him those questions than on a podcast where other people may have similar questions. So we'll come back to that. But yeah, so stay tuned and come back to this same bat time, same bat channel to catch any of those episodes. All right, so back to you, Damon. You had sort of talked about kind of what attracted you initially to PagerDuty.
Yeah.
And sort of taking on operations work. And one of the things that, as I've kind of been leaning into this, is this sort of the notion of this ticket-oriented architecture, if you will.
Yeah.
And lately, I've had kind of a little bit of a rant running around this sort of notion of like riding the ticket train and how far you're going to get riding the ticket train versus changing your mode of transportation. But you're really kind of have the OG rant against tickets.
Yeah.
Like this has been a sort of I think a flashpoint for you for a while. So take us
Yeah.
back.
Sure. I mean, I think it just came back from, this is before we even started Rundeck. Just we did a lot of, put in air quotes, DevOps consulting. We were kind of known for, that's Alex Honor and Greg Schuler and other folks. We're known for helping people translate what they saw at the DevOps conference stages into big enterprises, right? And we came at it from very much an operations towards dev perspective, which I think a lot of people were more much dev, kind of towards operations, like, how do you build a pipeline, right? Versus we're looking at how do you actually operate this stuff? What's day 2 and beyond look like? Because that's where most work, if you look at the pure volume of work, that's where most of it goes in an organization. And, if you think about what we're trying to do there, it's this horizontal flow, right? Trying to, from the idea to the customer's happy, that horizontal kind of view of the world, and really thinking about flow and feedback. And, also an idea that really then came along in the SRE gave a great name for, which is toil, right? It's that work that it's not adding enduring value. That's the key phrase. It's maybe necessary, but it's not adding something to the business. Might have to do it to keep the wheels from falling off the wagon, but it's not, we're not getting better. We're not getting closer to, we're not establishing a competitive differentiator. We're not improving what customers want from us. We're just sort of spinning our wheels. And most of that work, if you look at what goes in, you talk to executives and they always think about operations. They're like, I feel bad saying this because everyone's working so hard, but I don't feel like anything's getting done. Right. And everything takes too long and costs too much. Right. Why is that? Right. And if you really get into it, a lot of it has to do with the coordination costs. Right. So dealing with, how do you take a bunch of people and enable them to collaborate on complex systems, right? Complex, constantly changing systems. And once upon a time, not that long ago, in the technology world, technology operations, things were very siloed, right? And well, first of all, the rate of change was very slow, so it allowed silos. But also, like you think about like the classic, like calling in the cable company to change your plan, right? You're talking to a human being who has like 6 different screens up, right? And they've got their CRM system, they've got their catalog, they've got their kind of green screen terminal into the whatever the back-end provisioning system is. They've got some maybe tickets or work orders, and they've got all this. And then there's like an actual separate payment window where they got to insert your payment, right, and get a code back and copy and paste it over to the account window. And it's always disjointed systems, and that was fine. We use the humans as that kind of meat glue, as people say, right, to stick it all together. Yeah. But now with the digital transformation, it's all come together. So now we've got these complex systems that everyone expects to change on a rapid basis. And this idea of saying, hey, we're going to put everything, it's not the ticket itself. Like having a record about something is fine. The problem is how do you manage those tickets, right? Well, we got this idea of all the ticket queue. You just stick it in somebody's queue, right? So if everybody has a queue and we just stick this piece of work in your queue, it'll all be great, right? But we know what happens, right? We have mismatches in the queues, mismatches in information. So we got a lot of back and forth. We got a lot of bottlenecks. We have to have, a bunch of program managers prioritize things and push things around. And we have a mix of like sort of classic help desk, first in, first out type work combined with, time is money, complex things. We need more of a swarm approach to solving. And so those tickets add all of this cost, right? And it's, I think, the ticket queues, I should say. I don't blame tickets. Ticket queues are the reason why we have such high coordination costs, right? And those coordination costs chew up everyone's time. Now it's worse if it's like all this unplanned work that comes flying out at people. It just jams up all their queues. It interrupts that flow state, interrupts their ability to do things. And, it's like the worst kind. Unplanned work's the worst kind of work because then it just, it jams you up across the board. Right. So, I wrote some blogs that were really well received that are more eloquently stated than I just stated. But, it's a problem of saying that all work is appropriate to go through ticket queues is kind of a conventional wisdom that we've had for decades in operations, and the notion that, oh, we'll just turn the crank faster, we'll just sort the tickets better, right? We'll just have better, swim lanes to get around, these bottlenecks. We just never quite get there. And as the world gets more complex, we're just making bigger problems for ourselves. And it's a reason why operations takes too long and costs too much.
Yeah, you started to touch on it there in terms of like as the world gets more complex, as things go faster. Like, so what is you mentioned kind of had a sort of holding this idea for a while now. So I'm
Yeah.
just curious, like, what do you see more recently that is there anything that's sort of catalyzing change or should be a catalyst for change in terms of, you
Yeah.
know, relying on this conventional wisdom of turning the crank faster is not going to serve you. Is there
Yeah.
anything like that you're seeing out there?
Sure. I mean, really, we always kind of laugh at it in the trenches, right? Digital transformation. What does that mean, right? But
Mhm.
it's really that desire to say, hey, we need to merge all of this technology and make it always on, always available by anybody from any device, and allow all these new business models to flourish, from allowing access to our data and our APIs, and it's really that the idea of digital transformation. That's that kind of board level desire that I think is very strong. And to make that happen, we have to build these new ephemeral, highly, easy to combine infrastructures, right? Which are environments, which is this kind of cloud native um, explosion, right? Which is bringing you all of this, the kind of ephemeral dynamic ability to build ephemeral dynamic infrastructure to, drive these services. And then we've got this DevOps movement that's trying to make that speed happen. How can we deliver faster and faster and get more turns at the release cycle so we have a competitive advantage? And then we've got SRE coming saying, hey, how we should, think about our infrastructure like developers would, and how we manage things. So all this stuff is coming together, right? With this business desire coming with all these kind of technology trends, to where the complexity and the speed, right? The responsiveness by which, these organizations need to respond to both external, like customer demands, and internal, customer demands. It's just driving the complexity, off the walls, right? I mean, before us, things were very kind of complicated individual systems. Now they're truly, complex, complex systems. But that happening means there's just going to be more unplanned work, because we can't really predict how these systems are going to react, or what did we forget, or what did we not know when we set out, or what kind of unknown, odd failure state, right? All this is sort of coming to a head now, and now we got this new demand, which is this whole generative AI, right? Like, hold on, let's add a whole nother complex stack that we really don't even know how it fully works, right? Now let's
Yeah.
add that into our operational mix. So the complexity train has left the station, and it's, it turns out it's a bullet train, right? So I think we've already reached that point where the old ways don't work. And it's not saying, hey, just don't have tickets anymore, right? I mean, there's, it's more just saying there's a certain classes of work that working through queues is just more costly and more damaging than it's actually worth. And the big problem is that people just don't have, they weren't often aware there's alternatives. This conventional wisdom that, like, this is just how operations works. And you sort of have one of two problems. Either you have this idea of where, this ticket going into the queue, and it's just, what's a ticket? It's like a bunch of information fields, right? And you can set them in status or whatever. And then there's like a comment, like a Reddit comment, comment thread down below, right? And it's like, how do you collaborate in that effectively, right? When all those things are constantly changing, and now it's like a comment stream, and just, you watch all these important tickets, it just sort of dies, right? Because it kind of hit this weird like discussion state. Or you do the other idea, which is you break it up into a bunch of little tickets, right? And put it in different people's backlogs. But now you've lost all that glue. You've lost the holistic picture there.
Yeah.
And you've got a program manager run around saying, oh no, something changed, and we got to update like 7 tickets and dependencies. And if one person does it out of order, there's a problem, right? So, the classic modes of working through queues is just very expensive, and we could hang on and kind of get by with enough, program managers expediting and enough sort of just dealing with the pain, we could make it work. But I think now we've hit this tipping point to where we can't. And I think organizations who figure this out are going to find so much more capacity that they didn't even know was there, right? So it's, they're going to be more responsive, which is going to make their customers happy and their business counterparts happy. And they're going to be more responsive with fewer people. So it means they could use those people to go do the stuff that's actually moving the business forward, right?
Yeah. No, it's funny. I was just this morning on a research call, kind of, marketing people. Sometimes we do marketing research, and I was interviewing a VP who had, a couple things when we kind of got into talking about their ticketing system, which turned out to be very important in their dealing with unplanned work.
Mhm.
But this person described it like one of the challenges, or like it needs a lot of hand holding. That was like the words that they used.
Yep.
I thought was exactly what you described, right? Whether it's like, no matter which way you slice and dice the problem, like you end up with just hand holding. Are these things getting done? Are they being updated? Like, how's it? And he had kind of an epiphany partway through that was like, he's like, actually, the biggest problem is like getting the work that really needs to be done, even like properly into it in the first place, which makes me kind of wonder, it's like, well, is that really the problem to solve? But I think that idea of like, how do you get that coordination happening in real time?
Yeah.
Actually, like, you, without even the artifact, but just that idea of like, that's the problem to solve, which is a very, different shaped problem than how do I fill out this ticket form?
Yeah. And,
So,
that's interesting because it's one of these things too where it's a little, it hides in plain sight, this problem. Because we often just think about it as like, oh, there's this like process, and the process is to, provision something, or the process is to fix something or update something, or maybe there's a investigation, has this thing working well or not, right? So this process to do, like we think about it like, oh, we get a person to this, a person to do that, we pass them through this workflow, great. But the reality is that's just one like slice of what's going on, right? There's hundreds of those slices going on inside, any sizable company, all at the same time. And the people that are at the end of the rainbow in all those processes are like the same small subset of, key subject matter experts that get called into everything, right? So it's like, it's really insidious because you don't see it from the mega view. Everybody sees it from their myopic view. So they're like, it's friction is the way it is. They don't see how it adds up. And then they also don't realize that, like, like you hear a lot of folks, like, it's funny, like I've seen organizations talk about their different ITIL processes, and they got change management and incident management and problem management and all these different like processes. And it's always like, it's Jennifer and Bob at the end of all of those. So like, what do you do? Now they have like 6 people yelling at them about their important processes when they're just like, I'm just churning from one thing to the next the best I can, right? And so I think it's a problem. It's also kind of a visibility problem, because when you're in it, your just face is rubbing on the tree all day, right? And so you're just seeing tree bark. And when you're the leadership, you're like Google Maps view, seeing the forest, right? You're kind of missing that in between view to understand, like, hey, how does this stuff actually come back to bite us as a company? One side's too low to understand the impact and to see the bigger picture, and the other, who really feels the pain, like the executive you're talking to, can't get a handle on, why is this stuff so hard? And often it leads to this kind of reinforcement of our conventional wisdom, which is, if we just planned harder and if we just manage our queues faster, then we're going to get through this problem, right? And it's like, we've tried that for 20 plus years and it hasn't gotten any better. And now it's reaching a tipping point where, it's becoming untenable for most folks.
Yeah, this raises a question for me about, you mentioned how, well, that's really, really visceral imagery of the face on the tree bark, which took me a second to realize, seeing the forest from the trees, like the tree you're not much closer to it if your face is ready.
Is right on the tree all day. You can give a hoot about seeing the forest, right? You're like,
Yeah, I just thought that was like at first just describing something really painful, and then later I was like, oh, I get it. Versus the Google Maps view.
Yes, exactly.
But that it begs the question then, like, who's really best equipped to solve this problem? Like, who's able to look at it and step back and say, like, we need a different way.
Yeah.
Like, to like sort of quote the Mandalorian, this is not the way. Like,
well, I mean, I think there's the macro view, which is admitting like this is a problem and admitting there is a better way to do this, right? I think from the implementation perspective, it's sort of like let's go back to the forest one. You just got to start chopping down trees, right? And I think, the best way to think about it is you really have two moves here, right? One is to automate as much of the work as possible, right? So to keep the work off of folks, right? Actually, let me back up. The first thing is to not have handoffs at all. So the first thing is think about your organizational design and to be like, wait a minute, like why are we handing off in the manufacturing world, the lean world, they call it partially done work, right? Where it's like there's value being created for a customer, which is their sort of end view of how they view things. And to say, why is like one person doing part A, then the person's doing part B, right? And that handoff point, because each of those teams are working with different backlogs, different priorities, different managers, different tools. And you have to hand that work off between those two people, partially done work that is. Not just like, hey, here's an API, consume this thing, or here's a finished part, consume this thing, but saying here's half of something, or here's like, you got to do the other half of that thing. First of all, just getting rid of those partially done work kind of style handoff. So that's a hard thing. That's organizational redesign. It takes a lot of effort to do that. I think so. Better start is okay. What happens to stuff handoffs you can't get rid of? First, we got to automate as much as possible, right? So this could mean putting things behind APIs, making sort of pull-based kind of automation where self-service is a big, huge aspect of that, or just being able to do sort of automated response, right? The other part of that is where you can't automate it, where humans have to get involved. You have to figure out, well, how do I kind of shift left? How do I pull as much of that subject matter expertise forward? So either the thing that calls the people in is doing whatever all those normal first blast of people you would call in, doing what they would normally do, right? Like automated diagnostics is a good one, right? It's kind of like, well, hey, there's something we have to fix. Well, first of all, the monitoring tool set is broken. Everybody's ever worked in operations. What's the first thing you do is check, like, is that real? Is this thing really broken? Or is it confused? Or does it really matter? Maybe something that's being monitored is not performing properly, but the rest of the service is performing fine. The customers don't know the difference. Okay, well, it's the different situation. So is this really a problem? What's actually happening? So that what's actually happening step is often where it all goes wrong. Like you start with like, okay, we got to bring in these 5 or 6 people who are on call for this particular, different parts of this particular service. They all do the exact same first 10 steps at the keyboard to check if it's them, right? It's the meantime innocence, or it wasn't me dance. So right now we're waiting and we've got like 10 people, right? Or 5 people. And then we got an incident commander. Then we got a scribe. And then we got all these other people, right? So now we're talking, there's, 5, 10, 15 people on the call. And you'll hear, from other executives we talk to, they're like, I just spot check, kind of jump in on a call. And they're like, I call in on like a P2 or a P3. And it's like, there's 30 people on the call sitting there watching the same 3 people every time, kind of do whatever they're doing. And so how do you dramatically cut down on that? How do you say, hey, how do we shift left, automate as much of that kind of early diagnostics and checking? When we pinpoint what's going on, how do we do a pinpoint escalation, right? With all of that context delivered to whoever's getting the pinpoint escalation, right? So now we're not only talking about shifting left or compressing the timeline, but now we're talking about narrowing that blast radius of those escalations. And this happens for just general project work too. Like, especially in this new complex world, it's like, oh, we didn't realize we needed this, or we didn't realize this is actually backwards on what we need to do. And so now what do we got to do? Oh, well, Dormain had us help us set it up, and it goes to you, and you're busy on something. Say, I don't know, I got it from somebody else. And now we're doing this dance, trying to find people to help us, interrupting other people, right? You're all supposed to be doing something else.
Right.
So it's this very same pattern. Like they say, like, unplanned operational work is just the same as an as an incident, right? It's just the blood pressure level is a little bit different, right? The incident, you're a little more kind of, pegged and, oh God. Whereas in general sort of project work land, you still have this unplanned operational work that pops up all over the place. And it's still the same thing. Someone's waiting and now somebody's interrupted. And chances are you're going to interrupt more than one person. And each of those interruptions is very costly. So kind of starting over again, it's like, first of all, try to get rid of those handoffs of unplanned work. That's organizational changes are important here. But often most people want to start with is say, hey, let's start with automating as much of that work as possible. And then wherever that doesn't work, how do you limit the impact on the organization to, help the humans reduce those coordination costs, right? So even where you have to have a multi-person escalation, how do you enable that swarming where you have a lot of automation involved, it delivers the context they need, it helps them run through, kind of standard processes and gets it done in a, quick, coordinated way.
Yeah. No, there's like, I'm picturing a beautiful, decision tree flow chart for how to work this through. I don't know if it's a tree that you can rub your face on, but it's a decision tree.
Kind of tree.
I am curious, like, you mentioned that like really first first principle is try to get to no handoffs, right? But that's the big org shift. Can people like aspire to that, but jump in at like step 2, let's just automate as much as we can, like chop down some trees?
Yeah, we see a lot from our automation products is just people say, not even in a non-incident context, just saying, look, like, even when we're on the same technical team or we work a lot together, and it's like, you keep asking me to do something, and it's like, well, here, why don't I give you a button, right? And you could do it, right? And it's like, oh, that's difficult. You have to like create this automation. It's like, well, we already know what we would do. So let's use our tools to quickly kind of build a workflow around it, have access control, have it driven by the resource model so it knows what's going on in the infrastructure. So it ties it all together. Now it's like we can just chop down some of those handoffs, right? To be like, hey, normally you got to interrupt me for a bunch of things. Or maybe the other things I got to interrupt you, right? So it's like, let's just create our own self-service interfaces there to cut down on having to drop tickets in each other's queues, right? So there's plenty that can be done, I think, at the team and organizational level. Likewise, we see people sort of at the business kind of line level, which is how you often think about their response. Be able to say things like, hey, this is a really important and but maybe problematic service. So let's figure out how do we layer in the right response procedures we talked about? How do we set up all the automated diagnostics so we get as much information as possible up front? How do we even do some auto remediation, right? Or auto failover is a common thing as well. So that buys us some time there. And then how do we set up so those people who respond, they have the ability to actually go and try some things, right? To say, hey, if the diagnostics say X, then try Y, right? And maybe want a human in the middle still hitting the button and eyeballing it. And if that doesn't work, then bring in, somebody else, right? So there's all these things you can do at a team level or at sort of a business line level to start to chip away at these, kind of negative effects, and then use that as a pattern to then go upwards or sideways, whatever direction you need to go to say, hey, look at this pattern. Why don't we do that across the whole organization? And hopefully we're showing them is, look, we're more responsive and we do it with fewer, impact on our people, less people, right? We're actually creating capacity, right? By not having to chew it up through these things. And if you can go broader with a message of, hey, we're going to, make you more responsive, right? Meaning cutting down on those timelines to either respond to an incident or to fulfill a request, right? And we're going to do it with fewer people. You're going to have a hard time finding people in your organization being against that, right? Especially if you're showing them a relatively, straightforward way to do it.
Well, so one thing that sometimes comes up is like, yeah, sure, automation sounds great. And to your point, right? Like step 2, which you can sometimes skip to, is automate as much as you can, but automation is not free, right? Like there's work to set it up.
Right.
But this is where I do want to come back to that word capacity that you used, but this
Yeah.
is also where I want to come back to everyone's favorite word right now, generative AI,
Yeah.
which is, but it's like 3 words, but somehow
Sorry.
we've turned it into like a 5-letter
Yeah.
acronym. And so coming back to that, like, how is generative AI potentially going to disrupt that barrier to automating as much as possible?
Yeah. Well, so it's funny thing about automation, right? We heard this a lot. Where if you talk to people closer to the keyboard, right? Hands on the keyboard, they're like, "Hey, you got a lot of automation there?" Like, "Oh yeah, we got everything, right? We got Ansible, we got Chef, we got Puppet. We got the run deck work we're doing. We got, tried some Pulumi, right? Like, but like they've got everything, right? And then really they've got it all on top of that. It's a ton of Bash and PowerShell and Python and whatnot. And so they're just swimming in automation starts, right? And then you go and talk to the people like at the, the VP and above level, and they're like, "Yeah, I don't think anything's really automated here," right? And kind of what they're talking about is like, "No, we've done a lot of automation work. I've signed a lot of automation checks. It doesn't feel like things are that different. Like, sure, those people who are experts, maybe they're 10% faster, 15% faster because of the automation work, but that's not transforming the organization. It's an incremental improvement, right? And so, I think what we're talking about is being able to focus those automation efforts and leverage that ROI for a greater good. And the way that we've seen it is to focus on that sort of unplanned work response time. It's a great way to say, look, we're gonna, what are we automating for? Because you're right, you have to make trade-off decisions. You can't just say we're gonna automate all the things. Like, it's a nice statement, a little cartoon person, but it's not real because you just don't have enough time or effort to automate all the things, right? It's a nice ethos, but it can't actually happen. So you got to focus on, well, what's going to make a difference to the business, right? And response time and capacity are huge difference makers. If you can make an operations, and when I say operations organization now, like everyone's in operations now, right? The whole build it, you run it, everything's trending towards, we're all in operations. But if you can make operations work more responsive and you can do it with less capacity or improve the capacity, give capacity back to the organization to do other things, that is that's where to start, right? And that'll justify the automation investments. It'll help you get the value out of the automation investments you've already made. And it becomes a kind of self-propelling improvement cycle, right? Because it's like, we created this extra capacity, right? Now what are we going to do with it? Well, we'll take some of it and we'll use it to build our operational capabilities so we can free up more capacity. And we'll take the other capacity and we'll use it to actually improve the business or do the things that we want to do. So that focus really helps get the business value out of that automation. And now tying it back, you said about generative AI, the point here is that to make your automation really work, it's got to work specifically for your environment, right? So everyone's environment, it's an altitude problem again, right? That everyone's environment looks kind of the same. Like, oh, we're all using the same technologies, we're all following the same sort of general patterns. But anybody knows if you go to work at a different company, like you dig into it, it's all different, right? Things aren't where you expect them to be. It's just everything's a little bit off, right? So it often takes people a long time. This is a different problem I'm talking about, to come up to speed, right? Or a lot of that tacit knowledge leaves the organization. It's a big problem. But just saying, so you have to have that specific, it's got to work for your environment, right? So that means human beings have to put this automation together. And, one of the things we always focused on is having multiple layers, right? One of them is that low code, no code, right? PagerDuty's Catalytic acquisition brought that capabilities into the platform. So very much like the human being, higher level workflows, define the steps, hitting API calls, asking for help, or, having different approval scenarios. That's great. And that's hard. But the other problem is then you got to go do something in an environment. It's a different problem because you got to know what's the infrastructure configured like. You have to use their existing tools, right? So we've already created all these bash scripts, already created all this Ansible. How do you leverage all of that to, go and do what you need to do? And, oh, by the way, there's PowerShell over here because it's all Azure, Windows stuff over there. So you got to tie all that together without telling the organization. You got to all learn a new language, right? But the problem with that is that if you're trying to put it together, it still requires somebody who understands how to write those scripts or leverage those tools. And often folks, even if they know how to do it, kind of sort of, they don't feel comfortable with it. It's like a blank cursor. I know the English language, but I don't know how to write a novel, right? So it's kind of like, but I could probably edit a novel, right? So what we're using the generative AI for, taking the long way around here, good thing it's a long form podcast, is to be able to say, look, like, get you on the fairway, have an automation co-author that you just say, hey, look, I'm trying to do this automated diagnostic for this Kubernetes, service, and, a few more details. And, oh, by the way, we use Python around here, right? And then to generate that job with all the steps, and each step is, where it needs to be scripts is Python, right? And then someone can eyeball that and say, yeah, that's pretty good, right? Or that works for us. Or I know I want to add a few more things or change it, but it really helps. It really turns that kind of pro code or high code requirement into more of a low code, even kind of no code experience, right? So that is, I think, where generative AI and automation are going to have the first big impact in automation. The second is then around, like, okay, how do we match the capabilities we have, in our holster, right? Our arsenal of automation. How do we match that to the need that we have today, right? Because often it's like, it's just sitting in some script directory, or it's sitting in a bunch of run deck jobs, or it's sitting, like, we have a bunch of stuff, and it's just labeled with a bunch of, like, I know what it meant at the time, and because I told you what it meant, but then we're the only two people that know how to call it or where it is, because we're the ones that created it and gave it these esoteric names, right? So in the eye of kind of, democratizing this, or, enabling people to do what previously you had to escalate the subject matter experts to do, I think what's, obvious is using generative AI as a kind of linguistic translator to say, I'm trying to do this thing, and I kind of know how to describe it in a, relatively decent way, but I'm not the subject matter expert in it. And having the AI sort of help find those things, or find the experts, for you that know, what to use, right? So that's the other that we're going to see it come about.
Oh, yeah, kind of like the librarian, the virtual librarian, for what could be a lot of dusty scripts sitting on the shelf somewhere that haven't been checked out in a while, but could be adding a lot of value.
It reminded me of, like, my early days of the internet, early days of, working there was these just super grumpy systems administrator types that, like, had been around for the early days. They're the old Unix folks, right? And they knew everything. I mean, they knew how to, like, soldering motherboards. They knew the POSIX standards. They knew, like, they were in, at every bash, scripting trick there was. Super grumpy, but, like, you'd come to them usually, like, you try to, like, yell at them over the cue ball, or if you had a laptop back then, you probably did. You'd have to try to, can we look at this? And they go, you idiot. And you didn't do this, this, and this. And you're like, oh, okay, gotcha. And so you'll go and do that, right? So it's like there's that deep, deep expert knowledge, right? So how do you bring that deep expert knowledge and sort of put it, excuse me, next to somebody, right? I think that's the opportunity of this generative AI, because it has this perfect kind of horizontally scalable, memory, right? And can help you to say, hey, and it can I notice these little anomalies, or, the last time this happened, we did this and it worked well, or, it could help tie things together for you. Or I can eyeball this automation we've got right now, and I can tell you instantly what it's going to do, whether that's going to match your, what you're trying to do, right? So it's like, having that super smart, just because they've been around the block person next to you at all times, right? That's the, if you want to personify it, I think that's kind of where this is going.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And the first one, the kind of the co-author, right? That's one I'll just drop in the chat for folks. But just the last question I kind of want to come back to, you've mentioned kind of capacity and creating capacity a lot today. And in some of our past chats, we've kind of come to this, like, the capacity conundrum, kind of coming back to something you said at the very beginning, which is, like, people look around and they're like, everyone's working really hard. Like, everyone is, like, my teams are running at 110%,
Right.
and we've got to figure out how to do 130%.
Right. Well, that's the only option. That's the only conventional wisdom way to do it. It's like, can I squeeze my people to 130? Because otherwise nothing's getting done, and I'm out of people. And now I'm being told I should have less people, right? Which is, it's going the budget we've got is going the wrong direction, right? But the workload is going up, and that's it's a huge problem, right? And I think we don't think about that often, sort of in the technology trenches enough, right? I think we're too used to the go-go times, right? Where it was always hire more people, that's fine, do what you got to do, take on all these extra side projects. There's a very different behavior than now, which is like, look, we need to be more responsive to the business, but we've got to do it in such a way that we can do more with the people we have, right? And those are, you've used our conventional wisdom, those are kind of orthogonal thoughts, right? It's like, you want to do more, give me more people, right? You want to be more responsive, you got to give me more people. There's no, it's like, you can't have it better, faster, and cheaper, right? But I think, what we were trying to explain to the world is, yes, you can, right? You can have it better, faster, and cheaper.
Yeah, I think I like that sort of checklist that you gave, right? For, thinking about, one, where can you remove the handoffs? Use that as kind of a guiding sort of star. Then automate everywhere that you can. And the third one was, kind of like emulating what the SMEs would do, and pull that forward.
You're right, which I would just say that's just a matter of, I like that idea, emulating the SMEs. It's very kind of AI, right? But it's really just the idea of like lowering the coordination costs. And how do you do that? You either enable other people, you take away the need to coordinate. That's the best, right? Sort of like taking away the handoff. And then, you make it so when people do have to coordinate, it's only the right people at the right time. They're given the right context, right? And there's something that helps guide them through that process. Because like, there's, in any kind of work, there's sort of the detection or notification side of things. Like, we know there's something that needs to be done. Then there's the decision-making process. And then there's, okay, now we know we've got to take action, right? And most tools out there, in fact, even, old school PagerDuty, were just notifiers. Even a ServiceNow ticket, it's a notification. It's a work permission system. There's work to be done, right? Then people go somewhere else and they're in an ad hoc chat, or, at the keyboard, or to Zoom, or in a, in a war room, Zoom room, whatever, trying to, decide, like, is this actually a problem? Why is it a problem? What do we think, the problem may be? And then what can we do about it, right? And then once those make that act of making those decisions is full of friction and coordination costs. And then after that, it's like, okay, we're gonna have to go and actually do something. And often that do something has all kinds of coordination costs as well, because we've got to coordinate, let's call it joint coordinated activity, right, across, some complex operation, right? So, and I like the coordination cost idea as well too, because there's a lot of, sort of scientific research out there that is starting to focus on that, right? Especially from safety sciences world, right, where they study, like, aircraft disasters, and hospital operating rooms, and nuclear power plants, and air traffic control, and they call them the high consequence domains, right? Which shares a lot of common ground with the world of operating large scale complex internet systems.
Well, where would you, just to kind of close things out for folks, where would you recommend folks kind of go to learn more, read more? What would be a next step for folks?
Well, obviously, this Twitch party, I think, is a good place to go, right? Yeah, I mean, I think we're PagerDuty. I think we used to have a lot of strong opinions about doing this stuff back in, when the early days of PagerDuty. I think a lot of people learned on call and how to do this for the cloud through PagerDuty. And I think, in the last year or so, we're really starting to kind of amp up our mission, to help kind of revolutionize operations again. So I think there's a lot of, our operations guides and other kind of, things that we produce are great. I think if you want to go back to basics, I think, the SRE books are pretty good spot as well.
Yeah. I will make sure to include the ops guides in show notes. Thank you so much, Damon, for joining us today. Just a reminder for folks, those upcoming episodes I mentioned, next week we'll have Hadija Creary on, and she's got a mental model for, you hear about customer success teams, you hear about customer service teams. Oops, that's my phone. And if you're ever wondering, like, what the heck is the difference between these things? How should I think about them? Join that, because that's what I'm intending to try to learn from talking to Hadija. And then June 26th, speaking of generative AI, Lior, Ben, and Everaldo, that should be a really fun discussion on, how the kind of discoveries that they made working on the status updates with generative AI. That you may have seen in the blog post that I posted in the chat. And then in July, we've got Sriram Subramanian on responsible generative AI on July 10th, and July 17th, James Urquhart on flow architecture. So it'll be here 1 o'clock Pacific time, 4 o'clock Eastern on the PagerDuty Twitch channel. So thanks again, and have an uneventful day.